That was 3 weeks ago. Mira Voss had spent those 3 weeks doing what she had always done. Being useful,
The evidence
being
is
present,
clear.
being the kind
Your
of wolf who
actions
did
have
not
brought
make her
shame
dying
upon
into
us
other people's
all.
problem.
The
She
council
had
has
filed
reached
her
its
pack of
verdict.
correspondence. She had trained the junior wolves on Tuesday mornings. She had smiled at the right moments and said nothing at the wrong ones, and gone back to her room each night and pressed her hand against her sternum where the incomplete bond burned like a coal that would not go out. Kale had refused to complete it. Her own mate. 3 months of refusal. 3 months of the bond eating her alive from the inside, and the pack healers had finally stopped pretending it was something they could fix. The bond requires completion or severance, the head healer had said, and without one or the other, it will consume her entirely. Kale had chosen neither, so Mira had chosen for herself. She stood now at the edge of Blood River, the border no Voss pack wolf had crossed in 40 years. With the water cold around her ankles and the enemy territory stretching dark before her, and 3 weeks of borrowed time sitting in her chest like an answer to a question nobody had wanted to ask. She crossed. She made it 12 steps onto the other side before the voice came from the tree line. "I know why you're here," he said. "I've been expecting
The
you."
evidence is clear.
Chapter 1.
Your actions
3
have brought
months ago,
shame upon
Mira
us
Voss
all.
had walked into the pack
The council
chamber
has
believing
reached
she
its
was attending
verdict.
a healing consultation. This was her first mistake. Her second was believing that the outcome of that consultation would be determined by medicine rather than politics. Her third, and the one she had spent 3 months cataloging with the particular thoroughness of someone who had run out of more useful things to do, was believing that the man who had chosen her as his mate had done so for any reason that included her survival. The council chamber of Voss Pack was a circular room of old stone with high windows that let in the afternoon light in long, pale columns. Mira had always found it beautiful. She found it less beautiful now. Standing at its center with every pack elder arranged in their formal positions around the walls, and Kale at the head of the council table with the particular composed expression of a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for the formality of the meeting to catch up with it. She had asked her question directly. She had always been direct. It was one of the things the pack had described as a quality when Kale first chose her, and which had quietly become inconvenient as his
The
intentions
evidence is
clarified
clear.
themselves.
Your
"Complete
actions
the
have brought
bond or
shame
sever it,"
upon us
she
all.
had said.
The
"Either will save
council
my
has
life.
reached its
I am
verdict.
asking you to choose one." The black mark on her wrist had been visible to everyone in the room. The brand that appeared when an incomplete mate bond turned actively destructive. If the healer's mark that every wolf in the territory knew the meaning of. There was no ambiguity about what was happening to her. There had not been for weeks. Kale had looked at her across the council table with the expression of a man delivering a position he had rehearsed. "Completing the bond," he said, "would tie me to something that is already failing. I will not anchor my future to a wolf who cannot survive her own mate bond. That is not cruelty. That is governance." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of wolves who had understood something and had collectively decided that understanding it was less important than not being the one who said so. Mira stood at the center of the council chamber and felt the words words moved through her and felt, beneath the cold shock of them, something she had not expected: clarity. Not comfort, not peace. Simply the specific, clean sensation of an ambiguity that had been tormenting her for 3 months, finally resolving into something she could see the shape of. He was not going to save her. He had never been going to save her. Whatever calculation he had made when he chose her, whatever convenience she had represented, whatever arrangement she had satisfied, it did not include her continued existence when her existence became expensive. He had called it governance. He had said it in front of the council and the elders and the afternoon light coming through the high windows as though it were a budget decision, as though she were a failing asset to be written off rather than a wolf he had chosen and promised, and who was dying because of the choosing. She pressed her hand against her sternum. The black mark on her wrist burned cold. She said nothing. This was not performed. She had not decided in advance to say nothing. It was simply what happened when the thing that arrived was too complete for a response, when the words that existed were insufficient for the shape of what had just been done to her. She stood in the silence and let the council and the elders and Cale himself observe her receiving it. And she was aware, in a distant and somewhat academic way, that what they were seeing was not the breakdown they had perhaps expected, but something colder and more final than that. She turned. She walked out of the council chamber with her shoulders back and her pace steady, and the black mark burning on her wrist and the afternoon light falling across the old stone corridor outside, and she went back to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she gave herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the full weight of what had just happened. 10 minutes. Then she began to plan. The plan was not complicated because she did not have time for complicated. The healers had said 6 weeks. 3 of those weeks she had spent on the inside possibility, the hope, diminishing daily, that Cale would reconsider, that the council would intervene, that some mechanism within Voss-Pack's governance would produce a different outcome than the one his words had promised. She had been useful and present and undemanding, and had trained the junior wolves on Tuesday mornings and filed the pack correspondence, and been exactly the kind of wolf who did not make her dying into other people's problem. It had produced nothing, which left the outside possibility. There was one thing that could counteract a consuming incomplete bond without the original mate's completion or consent. A new bond, freely given, of sufficient strength, from a wolf whose bond capacity was compatible. It would not erase the old one. It would overwhelm it, supersede it, give her system something to anchor to that was not eating her alive. There was one wolf on the continent whose bond capacity was documented as sufficient for this. Demon Reese, Alpha of Ironwood. The wolf whose pack had been Voss-Pack's enemy for a generation, to whose territory began at the far bank of Blood River, whose name was used in Voss-Pack as a synonym for the most dangerous thing you could approach. She picked up the river stone 3 weeks later as she crossed. She had not planned to pick it up. Her foot found it in the current, smooth, river-worn, exactly the size of her closed fist, and she bent and lifted it without thinking. And then she was on the other side with cold water in her boots and a stone in her hand, and 12 steps of enemy territory beneath her feet, and the voice came from the trees. "I know why you're here. I've been expecting you." She had prepared herself for many things, for hostility, for negotiation, for the cold transaction of a desperate wolf and a powerful one, finding the terms of an arrangement neither of them had chosen. She had not prepared herself for the specific quality of those words, the absence of surprise in them, the particular weight of expecting, not willing to receive or open to hearing, but expecting, as though her arrival was not a shock, but a scheduled event. She stood on the river bank with wet feet and a river stone in her fist, and she looked at the man who had stepped out of the trees, and she understood, with the specific instinct of a wolf whose bond capacity had spent 3 months being eaten alive, that whatever she had crossed into was considerably more complicated than the transaction she had planned for. Her wrist burned. She tightened her hand around the stone. She had 3 weeks left. She did not have time for complicated. She would make time. Chapter 2. Demon Reese was not what Voss Pack had described. Voss Pack had described him in the vocabulary of existential threat, as a force of nature wearing a wolf's face, as the thing that happened to packs that forgot to be afraid, as the answer to the question of what governed the Northern Territories before civilization arrived and decided it was in charge. This vocabulary had produced, in Mira's imagination over the years of hearing it, a figure of consuming darkness, something that required distance to survive. The man standing at the tree line in the pre-dawn dark was none of these things, and all of them simultaneously. He was tall, taller than Kyle, broader through the shoulders, with the particular physical presence of someone whose body had been shaped by actual use rather than the performance of capability. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, dressed in the plain working clothes of someone who had come to this tree line without preparation for ceremony. No guard, no display, just him, and the dark, and the specific quality of his stillness that was not the stillness of someone waiting passively, but the stillness of someone who had already assessed everything in his field of vision and had decided it did not require action yet. He looked at her wrist first, at the black mark, then at her face. "You crossed alone," he said. "Yes," she said. "No guard, no diplomatic party, no formal request of passage." "I did not have time for formal," she said. Something moved in his expression, brief, controlled. Not quite amusement and not quite something else. "No," he said. "I imagine you didn't." He stepped back from the tree line and gestured toward the path that led into the territory's interior, and she walked beside him through the dark forest with her wet boots and her river stone and 3 weeks of borrowed time. And he did not speak again until they were inside the walls of Ironwood's main complex and in the study that she would come to know well over the following weeks. Maps, correspondence, a working fire that had been burning for hours. He sat across from her. He looked at the black mark again. 3 weeks, he said. "The healers said 6, she said. "That was 3 weeks ago." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "I have sources inside Vospak's healer records," he said. "Under the Interpack Health Monitoring Treaty, which your Alpha has been violating by refusing bond completion to a wolf in acute bond distress. I have been documenting the violation for 11 weeks. She absorbed this. "You have been watching." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He held her gaze for a moment. I will answer that question fully, he said, but not tonight. Tonight I want to tell you what I can offer and let you decide whether to accept it before I ask anything of you. She waited. A new bond, he said. Freely given. My bond capacity is sufficient to counteract the incomplete one. It will not erase it, but it will supersede it. Your system will have something to anchor to that is not destroying it. The black mark will fade. The consuming will stop. Silence. The price, she said. 1 full moon cycle, he said. Long enough for the new bond to stabilize fully. After that, you choose freely, stay or leave, on your own terms, with no residual claim from me or this territory. She studied him. And if I choose to leave after the cycle, the bond severs cleanly. Cleanly, he said, with no residual claim. You have my word, and you will have it in writing under my seal before sunrise. She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, the complete absence of urgency or pressure in the offer, the way he had laid it out with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about how to give a desperate woman a choice rather than a corner. 1 condition, she said. Name it, he said. I am not a charity case. I will not be treated as one. Whatever I can contribute to this pack during the moon cycle, I will contribute. I am a trained administrator and a competent wolf, and I will not spend a month being tended like something broken. Something shifted in his expression, more sustained this time. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. He reached for paper and began to write. She sat across from him with the river stone in her lap and watched him document her conditions in his own hand, and she said, because she needed to understand the architecture she was entering, "Why would you offer this to an enemy wolf?" He finished the sentence he was writing before he looked up. "Because I watched you stand alone at that border 2 years ago," he said, "and I have not stopped watching since." He returned to writing. She looked at the fire and felt the black mark on her wrist pulse once, not with the consuming burn she had grown accustomed to, but with something different, something that felt distantly and cautiously like the first suggestion of an anchor. She tightened her hand around the river stone. She had 3 weeks. She intended to use all of them. Chapter 3. Ironwood did not feel like an enemy. This was the first thing Mira had to reckon with in the days that followed her crossing. The specific cognitive dissonance of a place that had been described to her, for as long as she could remember, as the most dangerous thing on the continent's northern border, and which presented itself, in practice, as organized and principled and governed by a code of conduct that Voss Pack's leadership would have described as ruthlessness, and which she recognized, from the inside, as something considerably more honest than that. Ironwood's code was simple. You said what you meant, you did what you said, and you applied both standards without exception regardless of who was watching. She had identified this in the first 48 hours and had spent the following days testing it against observation and finding it consistent. She performed her role carefully regardless. She was a guest, a temporary one by the terms of the agreement. She was careful to occupy only the space she had been given, to contribute without presuming, to be useful without building the particular kind of usefulness that became load-bearing, the kind that made leaving complicated because too many things had come to depend on her presence. She had learned this lesson at Voss Pack. She had learned it at considerable cost. She trained with the pack's junior wolves 3 mornings a week because the training master asked, and she had said she would contribute, and she kept her word. She reviewed correspondence in the Eastern Records Room because the administrator was understaffed, and the backlog was real, and she had the skills. She attended the formal dinners because her absence would have been noted, and noted absences generated questions she did not have the energy to answer. She did all of these things with the careful precision of a wolf who was performing residence without committing to it. The black mark faded incrementally. She checked it each morning in the window light of her room, held her wrist up, turned it slowly, catalogued the progress with the particular attention of someone whose survival was attached to the measurement. Day 4, the edges softer. Day 7, the center lightening. Day 10, for the first time in 3 months, the burn in her chest dropped below the threshold that had been her constant companion since the bond started its consuming work. She noted this. She did not celebrate it. Celebration required a confidence in the future that she was not yet prepared to extend. Kale's name arrived at Ironwood's borders on the 12th day. She found out from Demon's Beta, a quiet, precise wolf named Aldous, who had clearly been instructed to keep her informed of relevant developments, and who delivered information with the same economy of language his alpha used. Kale had submitted a formal diplomatic request citing mate bond rights, the legal framework that gave an alpha claim over a bonded wolf across territory lines, the mechanism Mira had known he might invoke and had calculated the risk of when she crossed. Demon had denied the request in 4 words: "The bond is void." She received this at dinner. She set her spoon down once. She picked it up again. Across the table, Demon watched her do this. He said nothing. He returned to his own correspondence, which he habitually read during meals in the way of a man who had more work than hours and had made his peace with the overlap. She found this detail: the correspondence at dinner, the maps rolled out on the study floor, the fire always already burning when she arrived, adding itself to a category she was carefully not labeling. The Ironwood court had begun to watch them. Not obviously. Not with the particular transparent interest of wolves who had decided a thing was significant and were waiting for confirmation. With the subtler attentiveness of wolves who had noticed something and were waiting to understand what they had noticed. Mira observed this and performed her careful distances more precisely. Demon noticed her performing them. She knew he noticed, because he was the kind of man who noticed everything and said nothing about most of it, who absorbed information with the thoroughness of someone for whom observation was a professional discipline and personal reflex simultaneously, and who chose his responses with the patience of someone who understood that most things revealed themselves completely if you gave them enough space to do so. On the 14th evening, he asked her, during the walk back from the formal dinner through the Eastern Corridor, what she had thought of the treaty language dispute his council had been debating. She told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked a follow-up question that indicated he had been listening to the specific content rather than waiting for her to finish. And she found herself answering it with the particular fluency of someone whose actual thoughts were being engaged rather than their performance of thoughts. And the conversation continued for the length of 3 corridors before she registered that she had stopped performing anything at all and was simply talking to him. She registered this. She rebuilt her distances carefully. She was not sufficiently careful. Chapter 4. The bond stabilization's most demanding phase arrived on the 19th day, without warning or particular ceremony. It simply descended, the way the worst things descended, between one moment and the next, in the gray pre-dawn before the rest of the territory was awake. Mira had been in the Eastern Training Ground. She had been told, clearly, specifically, by both Demon's healer and Demon himself, not to attempt the morning run during the stabilization's active phase. The bond was doing significant internal work during this period, and the body's resources were not available for additional demands. This instruction had been delivered with the particular precision that Ironwood applied to everything, and she had received it with the particular precision of someone who had understood it, and had then, on the 19th morning, looked at the Eastern Training Ground in the gray pre-dawn and decided that the specific quality of stillness that came from 3 weeks of being careful was more immediately threatening to her equilibrium than a run. She had been wrong about this. She became aware of the ground coming up toward her at approximately the halfway point of the run, are in the specific detached way of someone whose body had made a unilateral decision that their mind was the last to be informed of. She sat down in the training ground dirt with her back against the fence post and her knees drawn up, and the black mark on her wrist pulsing with the particular angry brightness of a body that had been pushed past its current capacity and was making its opinion known. She was not unconscious. She was simply finished, completely, totally finished, in a way that had nothing performative about it, and which she was too depleted to manage into something more dignified. Demon found her 14 minutes later. He did not ask what she had been doing in the training ground at dawn during the active stabilization phase. He took one look at her wrist, at her position, at the particular quality of her stillness. And he did what she had come to understand was his consistent response to situations that required action. He acted without performance and without commentary. He carried her to the healers himself. She did not argue. She was too depleted to argue, and also, in the specific honesty of extreme exhaustion, did not want to. He stayed through the treatment, sat in the chair beside the healer's bed with the same quality of presence he had brought to every exchange she had had with him, the quality of a man who had decided where he was going to be and had no interest in making it look like anything other than what it was. When the healers left, he remained. The room was warm and quiet. Her wrist had settled from angry brightness to a dull, manageable pulse. The stabilization was continuing, interrupted but not derailed. "I spent 3 months," she said, into the quiet of the room, "asking Kale to save my life." She had not planned to say it. It came from the same place that honesty came from when she was too tired to afford the energy of containment. Every time he said no, I tried to make myself smaller, less demanding, less inconvenient, less of whatever it was that made me insufficient to save. She paused. I kept thinking that if I could just become easier to save, he would save me. That there was a version of me, quieter, simpler, requiring less, that would produce a different answer. The fire was low. The morning light was beginning in the window above the healer's bed. There wasn't, she said. There was never going to be. Demon was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, few with the specific quality of a man saying something he had been carrying for longer than the conversation. You were never the problem. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at her wrist, at the black mark, now fading again after the healer's intervention, at the evidence of 3 months of someone else's refusal written on her skin. He did not look at her face. She looked at his for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, the plain working clothes, the fire he had built up himself when they arrived, because the room was cold and it needed doing, and he had simply done it. The man who ran the eastern perimeter each morning, who had denied Cale's request in 4 words, who had sat in this chair without being asked, and who had said you were never the problem with the weight of someone for whom that was not a comfort offered, but a fact being corrected. She felt something move in her chest that was not the bond and not the burn. She did not name it. By morning, she was back in the Eastern Records room, and he was back in his study, and the distances were reinstated, and the arrangement was the arrangement. But she carried what he had said the way she had carried the river stone, not thinking about it directly, simply aware of its weight, the way you were aware of something that had settled into a space and changed the distribution of everything around it. Chapter 5. The archivist's name was Corvin, and he had served Ironwood for 41 years, and he had the particular quality of ancient wolves who had been observing things for so long that they had stopped performing surprise at any of them. He requested an audience with Mira on the 24th day, formally through Aldous, with the specific courtesy of someone who understood that what he was about to deliver required advance notice and a settled recipient. She received him in the Eastern Records room, which had become, in 3.5 weeks, the space she associated most with the particular quality of being at Ironwood, the organized density of it, the work that was real and needed, the window that faced the morning. He placed a document on the desk between them. I have been reviewing the cross-pack bloodline records, he said, as part of the treaty obligation audit. Your lineage is documented in these records as part of the Voss pack affiliation register. However, he paused. There is a discrepancy. She looked at the document. Your maternal line, he said, traces not to Vospak's founding bloodline, but to the Riverborn. She looked up at him. The Riverborn line, he continued, with the patient precision of someone who understood he was delivering something significant and was going to give it the space it required, predates pack divisions by 4 centuries. It is documented in Ironwood's oldest treaty records as a line of wolves whose bond capacity operated outside normal mate bond mechanics. They could not bond incompletely. The Riverborn bond was absolute. When it either completed fully or it rejected the incompatible partner entirely. Mira sat very still. The consuming you have been experiencing, Corvin said, is not a weakness of your bond capacity. It is your bond rejecting Kale. The Riverborn bond cannot exist in incomplete form. It is constitutionally incapable of it. What the Voss pack healers identified as a bond consuming its host is in fact a Riverborn bond attempting to sever an incompatible pairing that it was never designed to sustain. She heard herself say, from a distance, "And Kale." Corvin placed a second document on the desk. Kale's bloodline is documented in our records as carrying a genetic bond incompatibility with the Riverborn line. The two bloodlines cannot form a stable bond. This has been known to Ironwood's archivist records for 200 years. "When did Kale access these records?" she said. Corvin's expression did not change. He was too old for his expression to change at things like this. "Our border security records show an unauthorized access of the treaty document archive 2 years and 4 months before he formally chose you as his mate." The room was very quiet. Mira looked at the documents, at the Riverborn bloodline tracing her maternal line back 4 centuries, at the incompatibility record with Kale's name in it, at the access log with its date. 2 years and 4 months before he had stood across the council table from her and called her failure his governance. He had known. He had known before he chose her. Before the bond formed. Before the first month of the consuming. Even before the black mark. Before the council chamber and the 6 weeks and the crossing. He had known that the bond would never complete, that the rejection was inevitable, that what he was selecting her for was not a mate bond, but a consuming that would produce her death on a timeline he could govern. She did not know why. She could construct hypotheses, the Riverborn bloodline carrying some value she had not yet understood. The political utility of a wolf who could be sacrificed on a schedule. The particular cruelty of a man who had called her failure what was always his fraud. She did not have enough information yet to be certain. What she was certain of was the shape of it. The outline of something that had been done to her deliberately and called her weakness. She pressed her hand flat on the desk. She was not breaking. She was the specific temperature of a woman receiving the final piece of information that completed a picture she had been living inside without being able to see its edges. "Does Demon know?" she said. Corvin paused. "Alpha Reese has been aware of the Riverborn records," he said carefully, "for approximately 2 years." She looked at him. "He requested the audit himself," Corvin said. "After the border incident, he has reviewed these documents multiple times." She sat with this for a long moment. Then she thanked Corvin for the information. She waited until he had left the room. She sat in the Eastern Records room with the morning light coming through the window and the river stone in her coat pocket and the documents on the desk. And she felt the floor do the thing floors did. Not collapse. Simply reveal the drop that had been beneath it all along. Demon had known. For 2 years. Since before she crossed. Since before the bond started its consuming work in earnest. He had the records. He had the incompatibility documentation. He had the access log with Kale's name and the date. And he had said, "I have been expecting you at the tree line," and had not told her any of it. She picked up the river stone from her coat pocket. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and thought about what she knew and what she did not know. and what she was going to do with both. Then she went to find him. Chapter 6. He was in his study. He was always in his study at this hour. It was one of the things she had catalogued in 4 weeks of careful observation. One of the coordinates of him that had settled into her understanding of Ironwood, the way the Eastern Records room and the morning light, and the fire that was always already burning had settled in. She had told herself she was noting these things in the way of a guest learning the geography of a temporary space. She understood now that she had been noting them in a different way entirely. She closed the door behind her. He looked up from the document he was reading. He read her face in the way he read everything, quickly, completely, without requiring her to translate it into words first. She watched him understand what she was carrying, and watched him decide, in the same instant, that he was not going to manage his way around it. "Corvin spoke to you," he said. "Yes," she said. She sat in the chair across from his desk. As she placed the riverstone on the desk between them, she looked at him. "Did you know," she said, "about the Riverborn records when you made your offer at the river?" He did not look away. "Yes," he said. "Did you know about the incompatibility documentation, about Kale's access log?" "Yes," he said. "For how long?" 2 years, he said. She sat with this. "Why did you not tell me?" "I was going to," he said. "Once the bond stabilization was complete. Once you were strong enough that the information would not destabilize the healing process. The Riverborn bond stabilization is sensitive to significant emotional disruption during the active phase. The records document this. I made a decision about the timing based on your physical safety." She looked at him. She heard the answer. It was reasonable. It was the answer of a man who had thought carefully about her well-being and had made a calculated decision in her interest. It was also, she recognized with the particular clarity of someone who had been here before, the answer of a man who had decided what she was ready to know and when, without asking her. "You made a unilateral decision," she said, "about what I was capable of handling." "Yes," he said. He did not qualify it. "Kale made unilateral decisions about my capacity for 3 months," she said. "He decided I was not strong enough to survive, not significant enough to save, not worth the anchor of a completed bond. He made those decisions without asking me, and he called them governance." Something moved in Demon's expression, brief and controlled and more honest than anything she had seen on his face in 4 weeks. "I know," he said quietly. "I know that is not the same thing. And I know that knowing it is not the same thing does not make it feel like a different thing." She looked at him for a long moment. "The bond stabilization is complete," she said. "I checked this morning. The mark is gone." She held up her wrist. Clean. The black mark entirely absent for the first time in 3 months. "Per our agreement," she said, "I am therefore free to leave." She stood. She picked up the riverstone from the desk. She held it in her closed fist, cold and smooth and carried through everything. And she looked at him across the desk, and she delivered the accounting she had been composing since the records room. "You gave me something here," she said. "Real work and real seeing and a fire that was already burning when I arrived, and a denial of Kale's request in 4 words that I have thought about every day since. I am not ungrateful for any of it, but I came to your border having spent 3 months learning what it costs to organize your survival around someone else's decisions about your capacity, and I am not able to do that again. She moved toward the door. The reason I said nothing, he said, is not what you think it is. She stopped. She stood at the door with the river stone in her hand and the clean wrist and 4 weeks of ironwood behind her, and she felt the specific quality of the silence that followed his words. The weight of something that had not yet been said pressing against the moment like water against a dam. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself 1 breath. Then she turned. Chapter 7. He came around the desk. He stopped at the room's center, the same distance he had maintained at the tree line, the same quality of presence that was not pressure but the opposite of absence. He looked at her with the expression she had been catching glimpses of for 4 weeks, and looking away from before she could be certain of what it contained, and she did not look away this time. What it contained was not what she had expected. It was not guilt, not the managed expression of a man presenting his justifications. It was something older and more exposed than either of those things. The face of a man who had been holding something for a long time and had reached the limit of his capacity to continue holding it. 2 years ago, he said, there was a border skirmish. Your pack's eastern patrol crossed into our territory. Not deliberately, the records suggest, but the distinction between deliberate and careless is one that border wolves learn to take seriously. My wolves intercepted them. 3 of yours were injured in the initial engagement. She knew this skirmish. She had been there. One of your wolves, he said, stepped out from the group and positioned herself between the injured and my patrol. Alone. No weapon. No authority to negotiate. She was not the patrol leader. She held no diplomatic status. She had nothing except her own body and the particular quality of stillness that communicates to another wolf, at a level below language, that the thing they are dealing with is not afraid of them. He looked at her. My patrol stood down, he said, without being ordered to, and they lowered their positions and took a step back because what they were reading in her, in you, made aggression feel like the wrong answer to the question you were posing. She remembered this. She remembered the cold morning, the injured wolves behind her, the Ironwood patrol across the clearing. She remembered the specific quality of her own stillness, the decision to be very, very still, because stillness was the only thing she had. I was at the tree line, he said. I had come out to assess the situation personally. I watched you for approximately 4 minutes. I didn't see you, she said. No, he said. You were focused on my patrol. You sent your wolves back, she said. I sent my wolves back, he said. And then I went directly to Corvin and I asked him to pull every record we had that contained any reference to the bloodline of the wolf who had just made my border patrol stand down with nothing but herself. He paused. That is when I found the Riverborn records, he said, and the incompatibility documentation, and Kale's access log. The fire was steady behind him. The morning light was full in the window now. I sent an emissary to Vosspack 6 months after the skirmish, he said, formally, with the documented evidence, requesting that Kale sever the bond on grounds of incompatibility fraud under Interpack Code. The emissary was refused entry and escorted from the territory. She had not known this. "I filed the documentation with the Interpack Council," he said. "It has been in review for 16 months. These things move slowly when the pack being reviewed has political allies on the council." "Why didn't you tell me this at the river?" she said. "When I crossed, you had all of it. You could have shown me the records that night." "Yes," he said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you arrived at my border dying," he said. "With 3 weeks left and a black mark and the particular quality of a wolf who has been told, repeatedly and by someone who should have known better, that she is the problem. And I made a decision, not about your capacity, not about what you could handle, but about what I wanted the first thing I said to you to be." She waited. "I did not want the first thing I said to you to be about Kael," he said. "I have been watching Blood River for 18 months waiting for the morning you would cross it. And when you crossed it, I did not want the first conversation we had to be about the man who was killing you. I wanted it to be about what I could offer you that was not about him at all." "You have been watching the river," she said, "for 18 months. Every morning," he said. "I run the eastern perimeter myself. I have run it myself since the morning after the skirmish. My beta thinks it is an unusual governance choice for an alpha of my seniority. He is not wrong." Something that was not quite a breath and not quite anything else moved through her. "The reason I said nothing about the records," he said, "is not that I thought you couldn't handle them. It is that I was afraid. Not of your reaction. Of the possibility that once you knew you had never been broken, once you had the Riverborn records and the incompatibility documentation and the full accounting of what Kale had done, you would have everything you needed and no remaining reason to stay." He said this simply, as a fact, with the particular honesty of a man who had decided that this was the moment for complete accuracy and was delivering it without self-protection. "And I had spent 2 years," he said, "wanting you to have a reason to stay." Mira stood at the door, not holding the handle, simply standing near it, with the river stone in her closed fist. She felt its weight, the cold smoothness of it. The night she had crossed, the water around her ankles, the 12 steps, the voice from the tree line. "I know why you're here. I've been expecting you." She had thought that night that he meant he had been expecting a desperate wolf from Voss pack seeking survival. She understood now what he had actually meant. He had been expecting her. Specifically, the wolf from the border skirmish, the wolf in the records, the wolf whose bond had been fraudulently formed and whose bloodline had been known to him for 2 years. He had been at the tree line before dawn on the morning she crossed, because he ran that perimeter every morning in case that morning was the morning. She looked at the river stone. She had carried it as proof of survival, as evidence of the night she had chosen herself when no one else would. She looked at him. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She was river-born. 4 centuries of a bloodline that chose completely or not at all, that could not sustain the incomplete. That had been rejecting Kale from the beginning because the bond itself had known before she did. She uncurled her fist. She looked at the stone in her open palm. Then she set it on the windowsill. Not away, not discarded. Simply placed. Available. Present. No longer needing to be held. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him with the clear eyes of a woman who had crossed a river in the dark and survived a month of becoming and, who knew, with the complete certainty of a bond that had rejected one man and was now doing something entirely different, what she was choosing and why. "The Interpack Council," she said. "The incompatibility fraud documentation." "Still in review," he said, though considerably less slowly as of last week. "I want to see the records," she said. "All of them. Each the Riverborn documentation, the incompatibility records, Kale's access log, everything Corvin has." "You will have them by this evening," he said. "Good," she said, "because I intend to submit my own testimony to the council, and I would like to understand the full architecture of what was done to me before I describe it in official documentation." Something shifted in his expression. The thing she had been catching glimpses of for 4 weeks, finally fully present, fully unmanaged. "You are staying," he said. "I am staying," she said. "Not because the bond stabilization requires it, not because I have nowhere else to go, because I choose to, because Ironwood is the kind of place that runs its perimeter in the morning and has fires already burning and denies fraudulent mate claims in 4 words. And I find that I am considerably more interested in building something inside those qualities than I am in exercising my right to leave." She took one step closer. "And because," she said, 2 years is a long time to watch a river." He took her hand. She let him. Epilogue. 8 months later. Blood River in early summer ran clear and shallow over its smooth stones, nothing like the dark, cold crossing of 11 months ago, when the water had been at its autumn depth, and the pre-dawn dark had turned everything it touched into shapes rather than objects. In the summer morning light, it was simply a river, pretty even, the kind of thing you might cross for pleasure rather than survival. Mira stood at the bank where she had crossed and felt the morning on her face and thought about the distance between those 2 crossings, not in miles, and which was negligible, but in everything else. Kale's fate had arrived 4 months ago in the particular form that Ironwood's documentation tended to produce: thorough, irrefutable, and delivered without drama. The Interpack Council had completed its review of the incompatibility fraud case, accelerated, as Demon had noted, by the submission of Mira's own testimony alongside Ironwood's records and the access log bearing Kale's name and date. The council's findings had been unanimous. Kale had been stripped of his alpha title. His bond authority had been permanently revoked. The Voss Pack Council had been restructured under independent oversight, and the Riverborn bloodline had been formally recognized in Interpack treaty law for the first time in 4 centuries. A legal standing that had implications Corvin was still mapping with the particular focused joy of an archivist given a genuinely significant project. Mira had submitted her testimony in the 3rd month and had not thought about Kale since. She had found, to her lack of surprise, that the accounting of what had been done to her was easier to make than the 3 months of asking him to save her had been. The difference between describing a wound and inhabiting it was the difference between past tense and present, and she was firmly, irrevocably in the past tense, as far as Kale was concerned. She opened her hand. The river stone sat in her palm, gray-brown, river smooth, the size of her closed fist. She had carried it for 11 months, through the crossing and the bond stabilization and the archivist's records and the breaking point and the choosing and everything that had come after. It had been in her coat pocket through council testimony and formal dinners and Tuesday morning training sessions and the particular ordinary accumulation of a life being built inside a place that had fires already burning. She did not need it anymore, not as proof of survival. She had 8 months of living as evidence of that. Unremarkable and daily and far more convincing than a stone. Not as a reminder of the night she had chosen herself. She had chosen herself again since, in smaller ways and larger ones, and the practice had become less a deliberate act and more a habit. The way things became habits when you did them enough times that they stopped requiring conscious decision. She crouched at the river's edge. She set the stone back in the water, not thrown, not discarded, simply returned. It settled among the other smooth stones on the riverbed, with the particular ease of something going back to where it had come from. She watched it for a moment. Then she straightened. She heard the particular quality of quiet that arrived at the eastern perimeter when Demon finished his morning run. She had learned this, too, in 8 months, the specific signature of his presence in the landscape around her. He appeared at the bank beside her a minute later, slightly warm from the run, in the plain working clothes he always wore for it. He looked at the river. He looked at her empty hand. He did not ask. She did not explain. He took her hand and she leaned into him, and they stood together at the bank of Blood River in the early summer morning, in the place where she had crossed with nothing and had found, entirely on her own terms and nobody else's, that nothing had been more than sufficient to begin with. Behind them, Ironwood's eastern wall caught the first full light of the morning. The fires inside were already burning. Wolf pack. If you stayed until the very last word, you know that the bravest thing Mira did was not crossing that river. It was setting the stone down when survival was no longer the point. Drop in the comments. When the archivist revealed what Cale had known all along, did it make your blood run cold? Did you see it coming? Like this story, subscribe so the wolf pack never misses what comes next. And let's see how far Mira's story travels.